The prairie stretched before them, a muted sea of gold and brown, its edges blurred by the pale haze of dawn.
Mara stepped off the freight wagon, her ankles stiff from the long journey, her hands bound in coarse rope that chafed against her wrists. Her hair, once loose and wild, had been braided tightly, a ribbon of her former life twisted into a symbol of the ownership she had lost. She looked up at the small town that greeted her, its buildings sun-baked and weary, and felt the weight of all she had left behind pressing upon her chest. Windows opened just enough for eyes to peer through slats. Porches bore witnesses whose expressions were unreadable, the silence between their glances like dry wind whispering through the grass. Every footstep she took seemed to echo her shame, her fear, and the invisible ledger of her father's debt that had sold her into this place. The cowboy who had purchased her waited slightly apart, a dark silhouette against the soft morning light. Eli stood tall, shoulders squared but not rigid, a calmness that seemed to absorb the murmurs of the crowd around them. He did not speak, did not glare, did not offer the hollow consolations of sympathy. Instead, he moved deliberately, carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to solitude and responsibility. When he handed her a blanket, folded and rough with the smell of tobacco and leather, there was no flourish, no hint of ownership, only practicality. The cabin he guided her to was small, its logs weathered, chinks between them letting in a persistent wind that carried the scent of dust and distant pine. The first night was cold. Mara huddled under the blanket, listening as the wind whistled through the cracks. Dust stirred along the floorboards, and the fire cast trembling shadows across the walls. She studied him as he moved about the cabin, silent and purposeful, the rifle resting against the corner wall, the scars etched into the backs of his hands, the measured way he stacked wood for the fire. Each detail told a story of past trials, of survival, of a life tempered by hardship. Mara had known only a world of chaos and betrayal. Here was someone shaped by a steadiness she could scarcely imagine. Yet even in his quiet, there was no pressure, no expectation, no claim beyond the shared space of the cabin. She could breathe without his permission, move without consequence. That in itself was a revelation. Outside, the town seemed to hold its breath. The murmurs of neighbors faded into the early morning, replaced by the low hum of the prairie. Insects beginning their day, a distant river trickling over stones, the occasional call of a hawk. Mara felt her chest tighten, her mind swarming with fragments of a life she had been forced to abandon. There was the market where she had once helped her mother, the riverbank where she had dared to dream of freedom, the quiet room at home that now existed only in memory. All of it seemed both immediate and impossibly distant, as if tethered to her by invisible threads she could not yet untangle. Eli did not press her to speak. He did not demand gratitude or explanation. When he brought her a simple meal, a slice of bread, a small cup of strong coffee, he set it before her and returned to his own tasks, leaving her to eat in silence. She noticed the careful way he handled the fire, the precision in which he stacked the kindling, the ritual in which he maintained the cabin as if each act were a prayer for order against a world full of disorder. She began to understand that the steadiness he offered was not passive. It was intentional. Protection without claim, safety without demand. She had never known such a thing could exist. As the night deepened, Mara's thoughts became tangled with shadows. Memories she had long tried to suppress pressed forward. The cold judgment of townsfolk when she was a girl, the empty eyes of her father when he had failed her, the whispered bargains that decided her fate. But beneath the weight of these memories, there was a fragile glimmer of something unfamiliar. Trust. It stirred quietly, like the first hints of sunlight brushing the prairie, faint yet undeniable. She realized that her journey, her tentative step toward reclaiming herself, would begin here, in the quiet, unspoken space shared with a man who had endured loss and solitude in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Morning came slowly, pale and hesitant. Dust motes drifted in the shafts of light that spilled through the cabin window. Mara felt the heat of the fire on her face, smelled the faint tang of wood smoke, and noticed for the first time the minute details of Eli's presence, the slight tilt of his head as he watched her, the rhythm of his breathing. the way his hands moved with care even when performing ordinary tasks. She understood, with a clarity that both startled and comforted her, that he was a man who measured his actions against principles, not impulse, a man who valued dignity as much as life itself. And in that moment, Mara felt the first faint stirrings of hope. A life measured in quiet acts of care, in steadfast protection without demand, seemed possible. Not freedom as she had imagined it as a child, wild and unrestrained, but freedom nonetheless, the freedom to exist, to begin again, to discover safety and trust without the price of surrender. She did not speak. There was no need. The understanding passed between them, wordless but complete. And for the first time since she had been sold, Mara allowed herself to believe that perhaps there was a place in this harsh, sun-baked world where she could survive, and perhaps, in time, even live. Mara spent the morning unpacking the few belongings she had brought with her, each item a fragile fragment of a life that felt both distant and unbearably close. She unfolded a worn shawl, the edges fraying with age, its faded pattern a ghost of her mother's handiwork. She traced the threads with her fingers, each line a reminder of hands that had once held hers, hands now gone. A locket, tarnished and heavy, fell open to reveal the sepia-toned photograph of a woman she barely remembered smiling in a sunlit garden, a memory dimmed by grief but treasured all the same. Letters she had never dared to send were stacked neatly, tied with string and yellowed with time, their words now little more than whispers from a past she could not reclaim. Her eyes lifted toward the horizon. The field stretched endlessly, tall prairie grass rippling under the wind, bending like the backs of old men beneath burdens they could not set down. Mara stepped out, bare fingers brushing the dry stalks, as though touching threads of memory themselves. Each step sent small clouds of dust into the air, the scent of earth dry and sun-baked filling her senses. She wandered to the riverbank, its water glinting faintly in the morning light, and felt the emptiness of space pressing against her chest. The loneliness she had carried since childhood, the cold absence of her mother's embrace, the hollowed-out home after her father's failures, rose in her throat like a bitter taste. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to shed, for there was no one to witness her grief. Only the wind and the low hum of the prairie heard her sorrow, echoing it back with a somber resonance. Eli remained on the porch, leaning against the worn wood with arms crossed, observing quietly. He did not speak, did not intrude, yet his presence filled the space around her like a silent current. He noticed the way Mara's gaze lingered on the weathered tools propped against the cabin wall, the fence post standing resolute against the horizon, the riverbank she traced with tentative steps. He saw the recognition in her eyes of endurance, of survival, the same principles he had long relied upon. Her grief, raw and unguarded, mirrored his own shadows, though neither had yet spoken of them. The sky darkened as clouds gathered over the prairie, roiling and twisting like the tumult of memory itself. Mara felt the first distant thunder roll through the hills, and it seemed to echo the storm within her. Each lightning flash illuminated the contours of the land and the contours of her own solitude. The wind picked up, tugging at her braid and sending dust swirling about her boots. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the rain that began to fall in thin, cold threads. Mara lifted her face toward the sky, letting the water soak her hair and run down her neck, washing over the skin that had known too much loss. The storm was both terrifying and cleansing. Her emotions mirrored its chaos, a turbulence of grief and fear, and a quiet hope she did not yet name. Eli finally stepped down from the porch, moving with the measured precision of someone who had lived too long with silence as his companion. He guided her back to the cabin, steadying her as the wind whipped her shawl against her legs, sending dust into her eyes. Inside, the warmth of the fire offered a fragile reprieve from the storm, the smell of burning wood mingling with damp earth. Mara sat close to the hearth, her knees drawn beneath her chin, watching the flames dance with shadows. In that flickering light, she glimpsed him not as an unyielding protector but as a fellow survivor. She saw the lines etched into his face, the tight set of his jaw, the faint sadness behind his eyes. and understood that he carried loss of his own. She learned slowly that his wife had died years ago to a fever that swept through their homestead, leaving him alone with cattle, fences, and an empty house. He had endured seasons of drought, storms, and hardship without complaint, yet she sensed the quiet guilt he bore for those he could not save: livestock, neighbors, even strangers who had stumbled into danger. It was a grief he carried without words, a shadow that mirrored her own. For the first time, Mara understood that pain did not mark weakness. It was the thread that tied them together. Two lives shaped by absence, each capable of understanding the other without uttering a single syllable. Time passed differently in that cabin, measured by the crackle of the fire, the creak of the rocking chair, and the steady drip of rain against the roof. Mara watched Eli repair a broken fence post, his movements deliberate, the wood and nails symbolic of patience and persistence. She felt a faint stirring of admiration and something more elusive, the recognition that she could exist alongside another human being, sharing grief and solitude without diminishing her own voice. The storm outside gradually subsided, leaving the prairie washed and glimmering, the earth dark and fertile, the air heavy with the scent of rain and possibility. Mara traced her fingers along the braid she had loosened slightly, a small gesture toward reclaiming autonomy, and allowed herself to breathe deeply for the first time in weeks. By evening, the sky had cleared, streaked with violet and gold. Mara sat beside the fire, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the locket resting on her chest. She felt a quiet connection to Eli, born not of words, but of shared endurance, shared recognition of loss, and the unspoken promise that they could navigate the trials of the world together. In the flickering firelight, she began to see a path forward, not one of instant joy or complete restoration, but of small victories, quiet resilience, and the possibility of trust growing slowly. Like grass breaking through dry soil, she understood at last that the shadows of their pasts need not define them completely. They could exist side by side in the silence, acknowledging what had been lost, while choosing what could still be preserved. In this cabin, amid the scent of wood smoke, the softness of a worn shawl, and the comforting steadiness of another human being, Mara felt the first real glimmer of hope that she could endure, and perhaps in time, even live fully again. The sky over the prairie darkened with sudden swiftness, as though the heavens themselves had taken notice of Mara's fragile existence. Thick, rolling clouds smothered the horizon, their undersides bruised with violet and green, threatening rain. Mara had been tending to the small vegetable patch beside the cabin, brushing dirt from her hands and adjusting the braided strands of her hair when the first drops fell. They were sharp and cold, striking her skin like icy fingers. She hastened toward the cabin, but the storm grew with alarming speed. Rain lashed across the tall grass, soaking her shawl until it clung to her shoulders, slick and heavy. The wind tugged at her hair, and each step became a struggle against the torrent. She froze for a moment, indecisive, the mud sucking at her boots, the horizon a blur of darkened prairie and wind. Then, through the haze of rain, she saw him. Eli emerged from the mist like a shadow forged of purpose, his hat pressed low against the rain, his coat pulled tight across his shoulders. He rode with deliberate force, each stride of the horse cutting through the storm's chaos. There was no shouting, no grand gesture, only an understated urgency that demanded she hold her balance and trust. He reached her before she could slip entirely into panic, guiding her beneath the folds of his coat, shielding her from the worst of the downpour with a strength that was quiet, firm, and unwavering. Back in the cabin, the world transformed into something smaller, safer, and strangely intimate. Steam rose from Mara's soaked clothes, curling toward the low ceiling, mingling with the earthy scent of damp wood and the faint tang of leather. Eli tended the fire with careful hands, coaxing the embers into a living blaze, the flickering light dancing over Mara's soaked hair and the damp shawl clinging to her skin. She sank to the floor, the warmth a sharp contrast to the chill that had penetrated her bones. The storm became more than a test of endurance. It became a crucible for trust. Mara watched as Eli moved through the cabin with quiet deliberation. His calm under pressure was evident, not only in the way he carried firewood or adjusted the kettle, but in the steadiness of his gaze and the measured control of his breathing. No words passed between them, yet his moral code, unspoken, firm, uncompromising, was as clear as the firelight reflected in the damp wood. He handed her a cup of coffee, the warmth seeping into her chilled hands. The gesture was simple, almost mundane, yet Mara felt the weight of it. He did not speak of obligation or duty. He did not ask for thanks. The small act conveyed protection, care, and a recognition that she was, at this moment, vulnerable and human. Later, when a strand of wet hair clung to her cheek, Eli brushed it aside with the gentlest of motions. When he tilted the rocking chair closer to the fire for her, Mara felt a quiet tenderness she had never expected from a man of such reserved presence. Each gesture, each motion, was deliberate, a silent declaration that she was safe, not because of words or possession, but because he chose to act with care. Outside, the storm raged, thunder rolling low and deep across the prairie, lightning cleaving the sky in jagged brilliance. Mara felt the tension of the storm within her chest, a mix of fear, exhilaration, and wonder. She had been alone for so long, abandoned and sold. Yet here, in the midst of chaos, she found a new rhythm to her heartbeat, a rhythm aligned with the measured steadiness of another human being. By the hour, as the storm began to slacken, Mara sat near the fire, her shawl partially dried, her hair still damp, her eyes following the steady lines of Eli's movements. The symbolism of the storm was not lost on her. It had come violently, unbidden, washing over the land and her own spirit alike, tearing at what was fragile, but leaving in its wake a sense of rebirth. The torrent had revealed their reliance on one another, their need for shelter, their capacity to endure together. In the quiet aftermath, Mara felt the first bloom of understanding. Love, she realized, need not roar. It could exist quietly, steadfastly, without demand or claim. It could exist in a glance, a gesture, the careful tending of a fire in the darkness. The storm outside faded to a drizzle, the distant prairie glimmering under a muted sun breaking through ragged clouds. Mara drew in a deep breath, the scent of wet earth and smoldering wood filling her lungs, and allowed herself to acknowledge the strange, powerful calm that now sat alongside her fear. She understood that trust was earned in shared danger, in the quiet moments that followed chaos, and in the silent acknowledgement of each other's resilience. Eli's presence was a testament to that truth, and she, for the first time in weeks, felt herself capable of leaning on another without losing herself entirely. Even as the rain tapered, leaving small rivulets trickling along the roof and windowsills, Mara remained by the fire, watching him move with care and precision. Her mind traced the path of the storm, the path of her survival, and the subtle ways in which human connection could root itself in the soil of shared trials. She realized that the storm had done more than drench her. It had clarified the possibilities that lay ahead. There could be protection without possession, care without obligation, and in that understanding, Mara felt the stirrings of hope, fragile, but persistent, like new grass pushing through soaked soil after a flood. Night descended fully, and the cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of residual rain dripping from eaves and the soft crackle of the fire. Mara, her hands wrapped around the warm cup, looked at Eli and felt a calm she had not known since childhood, a sense that she was no longer utterly alone. The storm had raged, as all storms must, but in its wake had left something far more enduring, the beginning of trust, the assurance of safety, and the subtle warmth of a human presence she could finally allow herself to welcome. Weeks passed in measured rhythms, each day folding into the next like the layers of dust settling on the cabin floor. Mara and Eli navigated the unspoken rules of living under the same roof, each step a negotiation of past scars and present necessity. Mara's pride flared at small slights, the remnants of fear that had been her constant companion in the years before she was sold. Eli, steady as the horizon, adhered to routines that seemed unyielding, stacking firewood in exacting lines, cleaning the rifles with almost ritualistic care, and preparing meals in silence. Neither spoke of the friction that hovered between them, yet it hummed through the cabin like an invisible current. The town beyond their fences whispered and muttered, suspicion threading the air like smoke curling from a chimney. Mara sometimes paused by the window, tracing the movement of figures on porches, or catching fragments of hushed conversations carried on the wind. The firelight inside made shadows dance across the walls, elongated and distorted, reflections of their own uncertainties. Mara would sometimes catch herself staring into the glass of the window pane, seeing not only her reflection but also the rifle that rested always within reach, a constant reminder of the fragility of safety in the world outside their small sanctuary. One evening, as the sun sank behind distant hills, a noise sliced through the usual quiet, a crack of splintered wood followed by a hurried footfall. Mara's heart jumped into her throat, pounding in her chest like a frantic drum. She darted to the loft, peering through the slats at a shadowy figure attempting to breach the cabin. Eli's voice was calm, low, and commanding, slicing through panic without panic itself. He moved with precise, quiet authority, confronting the intruder with a measured presence that brooked no challenge. Mara watched, frozen at first, then felt the stirrings of her own agency awaken within her. Her hands gripped the loft railing, knuckles white, mind sharp, heart aware. She was no longer merely a passive observer of her own life. She had learned to read danger, to anticipate it, to endure it. In the days that followed, the tension between them evolved, simmering beneath the surface of ordinary chores. They shared the drawing of water from the well, stoking fires and repairing fences side by side. Each glance carried weight, each silence held understanding. When Mara moved to fetch a bucket of water, Eli would tilt his head ever so slightly, acknowledging her presence without intruding. When she stoked the fire, he would sit nearby, the warmth of the flames bridging the physical gap between them. The intimacy was subtle, woven into their shared routines, rather than announced with words. Mara began noticing details she had overlooked before. The way his hands flexed over the rope as he tied knots, the meticulous way he lined his boots by the doorway, the quiet sigh he released after a long day's labor. These were not just habits. They were the measures of a man who valued order, who respected life and work, who offered care without expectation. And Mara in turn began to adjust. She learned to align her movements with his, to anticipate the small gestures, to act with thought rather than reaction. She discovered a quiet satisfaction in doing her part, in knowing that her survival and his were now interwoven threads in the same tapestry. Evenings became a time of reflection. Mara sitting by the hearth as Eli polished tools or prepared dinner. The flickering light threw the shadows of both of them against the log walls, elongating them into forms that seemed larger than themselves. She found herself listening for the rhythm of his breathing, the subtle creak of the rocking chair. He moved closer to the fire, the faint scrape of a blade across metal. Each sound was a marker of presence, of life continuing, of the possibility that two people could occupy the same space without one diminishing the other. Her pride, once a barrier, softened slowly. She began to understand that her past, though filled with abandonment and betrayal, did not have to dictate the terms of her present. The cabin, the firelight, and Eli's steady presence offered her an opportunity to reclaim dignity on her own terms. She could act, she could decide, she could survive, not merely endure. And with this realization came a cautious intimacy, a recognition that connection did not require surrender, only willingness and awareness. One evening, after another day of tending the fields and repairing the fences, Mara lingered near the hearth, noting the way Eli methodically organized the firewood. She felt a quiet pulse of gratitude, tempered by awareness of her own limits and his, understanding that survival was not solely a matter of physical endurance, but of respect, trust, and subtle collaboration. Each shared task, each wordless gesture, had become an affirmation of agency. She was learning, slowly but surely, that her past could no longer dictate her capacity to act in the world. She had earned the right to assert herself, to claim her space, to engage with life fully, even alongside another human being. The tension beneath the roof was no longer only conflict or fear. It was a bond forged from routine, care, and quiet acknowledgement. Mara had begun to trust, not because she was asked to, not because Eli demanded it, but because trust had revealed itself naturally through shared experience. And she had begun to see herself as more than the sum of her past sorrows, capable, vigilant, and resilient. The cabin, once a space defined by the absence of freedom, had transformed into a crucible for self-discovery and measured intimacy, a place where dignity could exist, even in a world that had long sought to deny it. By nightfall, the shadows softened, the fire casting a steady glow across their quiet domesticity. Mara settled near the hearth, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, eyes tracing the lines of the cabin she now called home. She allowed herself a rare, private smile, acknowledging that tension and trust, conflict and intimacy could coexist. In the measured rhythms of life beneath this roof, she had discovered not only safety but a tentative sense of belonging, and with it, the first faint stirrings of acceptance for herself, and for the quiet man whose presence had become a tether to a future she could finally begin to imagine. The night had settled like a heavy quilt over the prairie, the stars obscured by clouds and the faint glow of the moon cast pale light across the cabin and barn. Mara was roused from a restless sleep by the acrid smell of smoke curling through the window cracks. Her heart leapt into her throat as she ran outside, the chill of the night air sharp against her damp skin. The barn, their outbuilding of stacked hay and weathered timbers, was engulfed in flames. Bright tongues of fire licked the sky, casting an unholy glow across the fields. And the wind carried sparks like tiny embers of warning into the surrounding grass. Eli was already at the barn, moving with deliberate urgency, his coat flapping in the wind, rifle discarded at his side. He gestured for her to stay close, his eyes narrowed, the fire reflecting in their depths like molten gold. Mara's own hands trembled as she lifted the bucket of water, the leather strap cutting into her palm. She followed his instructions without hesitation, drawn into the rhythm of urgent cooperation. Pass the water, douse the flames at the base, pull hay bales back to prevent the fire's spread. Dust, ash, and smoke mingled with the heat, stinging their eyes, filling their lungs, sharpening every sense until the world contracted to the single point of the fire and the work that must be done. Their hands touched repeatedly, once brushing as she handed him a soaked bundle of hay, once as he steadied her on uneven ground, and each contact sent a strange warmth along her arm. The line between necessity and desire blurred, unnoticed at first, overtaken by adrenaline and the singular focus of survival. Mara caught herself glancing at him, at the set of his jaw, the controlled movements of his arms, the way he protected not just the barn, but her as well. The storm of fire around them seemed to ignite an awareness in her that she had not fully allowed before. Intimacy could grow in moments of peril, in shared danger, in silent acknowledgement of another's steadfastness. Hours passed like minutes, and finally the blaze was subdued. The barn smoldered, charred beams groaning as they cooled, the smoke curling skyward in long, lazy spirals. Mara's face was streaked with soot, her hair damp and clinging to her forehead, her clothes soaked with sweat. Eli moved beside her in quiet exhaustion, his own coat darkened with ash, a faint cut streaking the back of his hand. They stood side by side, surveying the aftermath, and in that stillness, Mara saw him not merely as protector but as companion, a man whose calm courage had guided them through chaos without need for words. The firelight from the nearby hearth of the cabin reflected faintly in his eyes as he finally allowed himself to breathe, and Mara's gaze met his. There was no declaration, no sudden rush of confession, only a shared understanding, quiet but profound. She raised a hand to brush the soot from her cheek, and he instinctively reached out, fingers lingering lightly, grounding her in the moment. A braid slipped free from her hair, falling over her shoulder, and she made no move to replace it. In that small, ordinary act, she felt the symbolism of trust and surrender, a letting go, not of herself, but of fear. They returned to the cabin slowly, their movements subdued, each aware of the other's presence without words. Mara poured water into a basin, and dampened a rag to scrub the ash from her arms, noticing how Eli moved around her with unobtrusive attentiveness. He prepared the coffee, its bitter scent grounding them after the chaos, and placed a cup beside her without a word. The intimacy of the act was striking, shared quiet, shared survival, and a recognition that what had been endured together had created a bond neither of them needed to name. Mara reflected on the moral weight of the night. Their actions had preserved life, had prevented disaster, had honored the work of their hands and the dignity of those who relied on it. The fire had been indiscriminate, a threat that demanded courage and clarity. And in the way they had acted, without ego or claim, Mara saw the quiet justice of life itself. Protection of the vulnerable, stewardship of the land, care without expectation. Love, she realized, was forged in these crucibles, not in grand gestures, not in overt declarations, but in steadfast presence, in the willingness to endure and act with integrity when the stakes were highest. Hours later, the barn reduced to smoldering ruin. They sat together by the cabin hearth. The fire's glow softened their features, painting the room in amber hues. Mara tentatively leaned closer to Eli, feeling the warmth of the flame mirrored by the subtle, steady warmth of his body nearby. She dared a glance at his face, soot-streaked but calm, eyes reflecting both the firelight and something deeper, a quiet satisfaction, a recognition of what they had endured together. It was not passion spoken loudly or acted upon without thought. It was deliberate, measured, and real. For Mara, this was a turning point. The trials of fire and danger had revealed not just the reliability of another human being, but the resilience within herself. She had faced terror, acted without hesitation, and discovered that courage could exist alongside tenderness. She could survive, and in the presence of another, she could also begin to trust, to lean, to let small gestures carry significance without fear. The braid that had slipped loose reminded her of all the restraints she had lived under, and the ease of letting it fall symbolized the first deliberate surrender to someone who had earned her confidence. The night wound down, the barn a distant silhouette against the star-speckled sky. Mara and Eli lingered by the fire a little longer, the only sounds the crackle of embers and their quiet breaths. In that shared silence, she understood the profound lesson of the evening. Survival and love were not opposed, but intertwined. Courage and care could coexist, and intimacy could grow in the spaces between necessity and desire, in acts of unwavering attention, in moments of quiet moral clarity. And Mara, for the first time in many months, felt the unmistakable stirrings of hope. Hope rooted not in fantasy, but in reality. The reality of a man who acted with principle, a woman who had reclaimed agency, and the fragile, enduring bond forged in the firelight, soot, and sweat of a shared ordeal. Weeks had passed since the barn fire, yet the echoes of that night lingered in the prairie air, as if the land itself remembered the heat, the smoke, and the danger they had faced. Mara moved through the cabin in quiet preparation, her movements deliberate, the small bundle of belongings she had packed resting heavy in her hands. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and empty, gold and green swaying beneath the soft wind of early spring. Life seemed to breathe again, tentative and fragile, yet full of possibility. The sound of hooves approached, long before the riders came into view. Mara paused at the cabin door, heart steady but alert, as a small group of men rode up the lane, Lawmen, recognizable by the silver badges on their chests, and townsfolk whose expressions betrayed curiosity and caution. Dust rose behind their horses, mingling with the scent of new grass and the faint tang of lingering smoke from the barn. Their arrival was deliberate, measured. They dismounted with practiced ease, eyes scanning the cabin and the surrounding land, noting the remnants of the smoldering barn in the distance. Mara stepped forward to meet them, her hands empty and visible, her posture unguarded yet firm. Questions came quickly, voices low but insistent. The burned barn, the mysterious intruder, the rumors of justice done. Mara answered plainly, recounting events with steady words. She spoke of the intruder's aggression, of the fire, of the steps she and Eli had taken to protect life and property. There was no embellishment, no dramatization, only the unvarnished truth. Every syllable carried the weight of experience, the authority of someone who had faced danger and endured. Eli remained at her side, silent, a steadfast presence whose mere posture reinforced her words. He did not interject, did not explain, did not demand acknowledgement. Yet his presence alone carried weight, the quiet strength of a man who acted according to principle, whose hands bore the marks of labor and protection, whose eyes reflected years of loss tempered by moral clarity. Mara noted the subtle nods exchanged between the lawmen as her account unfolded. They did not question her honesty, nor did they challenge the justification of their actions. With the questions answered and the lawmen satisfied, the tension dissipated, folding into the soft air of spring. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and freshly turned soil, and the prairie seemed to exhale, as if releasing the last vestiges of fear and smoke. Mara allowed herself a small, private smile, a recognition that they had not only survived the threats of the past weeks, but had preserved their integrity and dignity in the process. Packing the last of her small belongings, Mara felt the cabin and the surrounding land with a new sense of belonging. The prairie, once intimidating in its vast emptiness, now offered a quiet reassurance. She secured her bundle, lifting it with care, and looked toward Eli. He mounted his horse with the familiar, deliberate grace that had come to define him, the rifle resting against the saddle and the reins steady in his calloused hands. No words passed between them. None were necessary. The shared understanding of what had been endured, the trust earned in moments of danger and quiet vigilance, was enough. They rode side by side, the hooves of their horses stirring the soft spring dust. Mara breathed deeply, feeling the wind against her face, carrying the scent of grass and the faint tang of distant rain. The sun had broken fully through the clouds, illuminating the prairie with golden light that shimmered across the tall grass. Every hill, every fence line, every distant tree seemed transformed, as if the earth itself had shifted to accommodate the passage from fear to renewal. As they rode, Mara reflected on the journey that had brought her here, sold to settle a debt, abandoned, and thrust into a world that had demanded endurance beyond her years. Yet through hardship, through fire, through storms and quiet nights by the hearth, she had discovered her own strength. She had learned that dignity could survive alongside dependence, that courage could be tempered by compassion, that intimacy could exist without demand or possession. In Eli, she had found not only protection but partnership, a man whose quiet presence had become a measure of safety and respect. The horizon stretched endlessly before them, the prairie rolling gently into distance. Birds rose into the air, their calls mingling with the whisper of wind through the grass. Mara allowed herself to imagine the future, unshaped yet full of potential. The lessons of the past, the loss, the betrayal, the fear, had been transmuted into resilience and clarity. She could walk, could ride, could exist in the world without surrendering her own agency. And in the presence of another, she could experience companionship and even love, not forced, not claimed, but offered and received on equal terms. The burned barn receded behind them, a reminder not only of destruction but of moral courage. Mara knew that in their actions, confronting danger, preserving life, and honoring dignity, they had fulfilled a quiet form of justice. It was not a justice decreed by law or town opinion, but by principle, by the unshakable recognition that right action carries its own reward. The prairie, sunlit and expansive, bore witness to this reckoning. The land itself a canvas of endurance and renewal. As the cabin disappeared from view, Mara's thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the profound changes within herself. She was no longer merely a girl sold to settle a debt. She was a woman tempered by trials, strengthened by hardship, and capable of receiving trust, care, and love. Each hill and vale they passed seemed symbolic of the journey she had undertaken. The rise and fall of fear, the hard terrain of survival, the open plains of possibility. By the time they reached the horizon, where sky and prairie blended into a single golden haze, Mara felt a serene certainty. She did not need words to acknowledge the bond between them. Its existence was proven in countless quiet acts, tending fires, braving storms, confronting danger, and enduring together. Trust, respect, and the potential for love had taken root slow and steady, in the soil of shared experience. The wind carried dust and the faint smell of smoke from the barn, mingling with the scent of new growth. Sunlight caught on Mara's shawl, lifting it briefly as she breathed in the sweet air of spring. Firelight, storms, dust, and wind, all had shaped her, each elemental force marking a stage in her transformation. And as she rode beside Eli, she understood fully that the story of her survival, her dignity, and her heart's awakening was not one of abrupt change, but of quiet, earned growth. She glanced at him once more, and their eyes met, a wordless promise passing between them. Safety, respect, and second chances. These were theirs now, and the prairie stretched endlessly ahead, waiting for them to claim it together.